Hello and welcome to another episode of Who Knew in the Moment, the podcast. I'm your host, Phil Friedrich, and today we have a familiar face back with us for a second time, but it's Mr. Matt Babcock, and Matt is a NBA draft analyst. And so, as we have the NBA draft rapidly approaching here, we wanted to make sure to bring some insight. And one, how do we do, analysis on players and teams? But two, what is it looking like for this draft? So, Matt, thanks so much for being on today.
No, yeah, thanks for having me.
Absolutely. So let's get started with there are thousands of players here in the United States across seas that teams are funneling through. What's kind of the funnel? I mean, obviously, there's certain players every year that you go, all right, these are a consensus top 5 to 10. But then there's people in the back half of the draft that sometimes you're familiar with, and other times you go, how the heck did this person come in here? So talk a little about, what the process is to funnel players down into being, one of the, selections in the 2 rounds.
Yeah, I mean there's a lot of moving parts. I mean, especially depending on what time of year we're talking about. I mean, the start of the season, it's a combination of we're looking at a lot of potential one and dones. Kids that were McDonald's All-Americans, and in most drafts, the first part of the draft is a bunch of kids that are 18, 19 years old, have only spent a year in college, or young guys playing a lot of times smaller roles for top clubs overseas.
Right.
And so that's the most important part of the draft, obviously, is the top talent with the most upside that happen to be the youngest, where we've probably had the small sample size to evaluate them, at
Yeah.
least on a large or high competitive stage. And then another thing that's really changed. I wrote an article about this as far as the ripple effects of NIL on the NBA draft, and what's happened is exactly what I expected. That a lot of these kids that have college eligibility remaining that aren't in that sure first round or lottery range are going back to school to get the NIL,
Yeah.
get the NIL money. And so the second round, we'll see. I mean, there's been a lot of guys that have decided to go back to school already. A lot of players that probably would have entered the draft in years past that didn't even enter. So I think, from top to bottom, the player pool is significantly smaller than it is in most years in recent past. So yeah, just a lot of changes. But as far as starting the process, we cast a wide net, and a lot of it is a process of elimination. Obviously there's certain guys that really kind of earn their spot, but there's a lot of guys we kind of cross off saying, hey, he's not ready, or in some cases he might not ever be ready. And
Yeah.
so it's juggling a lot of moving parts. Really, it's a chip away process that's year round. I mean, to be a good scout, whether you're doing it in the media like myself as an NBA draft analyst or working directly for a team, it's just a day in day out chip away process for sure.
I love it. So you had a whole bunch of good points there. So I'll kind of work through them piece by piece. But one of the items you mentioned is small sample size. Hey, I've got their high school, and then I have 31 collegiate games, and that's what I'm basing this decision off of. Now, my question for you there is, as you're looking at a player, sometimes a player can be really good at one level, but it just doesn't look like their style is going to translate well to the next level, right? And maybe they're playing in a good system in college that put them in positions to score, but you go, well, gosh, you're really a point guard at the next level, and you're not going to be as effective as a scorer. So talk a little bit about that, analysis of, well, you did this in college and you did it really well, but I just don't know that that translates, over into the NBA and having success there.
Yeah, I think that's spot on. And I really look at each evaluation on a case by case basis. And just a couple of examples that I think fit what you're describing is, let's say a smaller guard that's really effective in college, an on-ball scoring guard. They're a dime a dozen in college. I mean, I feel like most of the All-American teams are with a few of these types of guys, and in a lot of cases they just don't translate that well to the modern NBA. So many of the coaches now want to play switchable, versatile defense, and a small guard just kind of naturally creates some issues just for the lack of size.
Yeah,
And the same thing can be said about a big-bodied five that
right.
doesn't move his feet very well, or doesn't shoot the ball well from outside. It just creates a lot of limitations. And of course, there are exceptions. Guys that are elite that are able to kind of overcome some of those deficiencies. But generally speaking, I mean, we do look at how a guy's game will translate, and a lot of it is physical tools, and then from a skill set, I mean, shooting. That there's very few guys right now that are able to earn a spot on the court without shooting the ball at least at a decent level. I mean, I think there's in most systems, maybe one guy in the court can not be a perimeter threat. In some cases, the coaches like all five guys on the court to be a perimeter threat. And so there's just a couple of examples of things we're looking at as far as like the translation from primarily college to the NBA.
Yeah. Now, just kind of using that as a segue, you talk about size, you talk about, maybe even, hey, they did that at a small mid-major school, but I don't know that they could have put the same type of points up at, had they been playing ACC day in and day out, right? And then you get the outliers, the Steph Currys, right? Where almost every draft, analyst said, man, small, undersized, not overly quick defensively. And he ended up obviously becoming one of the greatest shooters of all time, but a great player. And my question there is, as GMs are looking at this, how are they trying to get to what's that X factor, right? Because Steph Curry on paper, right, compared to other players, yeah, the physical elements just didn't line up well for him to have great success, long term. But there was probably a intense work ethic that he had that, a Johnny Flynn that was drafted in the same draft who was doing, similar things at Syracuse, people had much higher hopes for and didn't have nearly as long of a career. So you say, well, similar smallish guards, one had really done it at a large school, one was doing it at a smaller school, but Steph obviously ends up having a longer tenure. So talk about that. How do GMs, how do you as an analyst really look at that X factor, that work ethic piece of it outside of just the, eye test?
I mean, I think, with just scouting as a whole, I mean, analytics, advanced metrics are playing a more increased role in everything. But even with that said, it's an exact science. And so the way I look at it when evaluating these players, while they're still in formative years and they're still on this upward trajectory development plan, is really trying to gather as much information to properly assess the risk reward ratio, right? And so, I mean, with a guy like Steph, okay, he's at a smaller school, that probably lowers confidence a little bit, even though I mean, he was lighting it up when he
Right,
was at
right.
Davidson.
Yeah.
That still is somewhat of a negative. Like, yeah, he didn't do this on Duke. Like, what would it look like if he was there?
Yeah.
And the lack of size naturally, raises some questions. And there's concerns too with his lack of physical strength. He had major issues with his ankles early on in his career, and so these are all risk factors and things that okay are these things going to hold him up from maximize his potential and then what you're talking about is essentially is background intel and getting a grip of a guy's personality and his his habits, his tendencies, again, more indicators that will suggest if the kid's going to be able to maximize his potential or not. And it's our job as scouts to figure out who has the talent and potential, and then it's just a matter of okay, how likely are they going to get there? And obviously, Steph is one of the ultimate success stories.
Yeah.
But there's a lot of guys on the other end of the spectrum as well that had the right level of talent, but there are things, whether it be health or physical tools or lack of discipline and motivation, that held guys up. And some guys that even had successful NBA careers, if they had done what X, Y, or Z, maybe they would have been Hall of Famers, right? And so we've got a little bit of everything, because I mean, at this point, the NBA's been around for a long time, and scouting's become much more advanced. But we've got a lot of examples to lean on both ends of the spectrum, as I mentioned.
I love it. Now, as you're evaluating, another level of difficulty is the international game versus, the NBA. And it certainly has become a little bit more similar as, bigs have started to be step out 3-point shooters, whereas before, I think back in the day, evaluating Darko Milicic, and when he's going to be playing against Shaq, it's like, well, completely different players. There's not a lot of comparison that we could make there. But today, you have Luca who you can kind of see, all right, here's how your size and skill could fit in. So when you're looking at the international, side of things, and you maybe haven't seen him play against, US or NBA type, consistent, athleticism type talent, they're maybe playing in more of a finesse or, skill-based game. How are you looking at how that can translate? Because to your point, there's a lot of examples of players that have made that transition and do well. Then you have other stories of guys like a Ricky Rubio who had so much hype coming in. And I mean, he had a nice long career, but I think all things considered, you'd say probably never reached the level of hype that he came in with on the NBA stage. So talk a little bit about that on the international to US game.
Very challenging. I mean, there's no other way to put it. I mean, it's hard, and really you need to just read between the lines. And again, looking at it, the evaluation on a case by case basis.
Yeah.
I mean, using as many scouting opportunities as possible. Like sometimes, for example, a few weeks back, I went to Portland for the Nike Hoop Summit, and one of the teams was top international talent. And so this is a great opportunity for us to see some kids that were probably playing in small roles on professional teams in Europe. And so it's just you got to just do everything you can to gather as much information to gain confidence in your evaluation. Because the way I look at it is, when we start the evaluation, a lot of times it's when these kids are 15 years old. I mean, for example, I was in Colorado Springs this morning at the USA basketball under 16 minicamp. They had like 75 top kids. And it's just, for a lot of them, it's the first time I've ever seen them. But the way I look at it is, okay, regardless, I'm starting when they're 15 or it's their pre-draft year and they're 20. I'm starting with a blank canvas, and
Yeah.
I need to gather all these different nuggets of information, whether it be just evaluating their physical tools, their on-court talent, their analytics and advanced metrics or intel. I mean, you go across the board, all the different things. Every single nugget is sort of me kind of painting the portrait, right? And the
Yeah.
idea is, but by the time we get to draft night, I've got a fully painted portrait. And so, I mean, it's kind of one of those things where, by the time the pre-draft starts, in most cases, it's like a 90% done portrait, right?
Yep.
And now we've got to figure out that last 10%. As far as like the international kids, a lot of times it's a lot harder to get to that 100% than it is, at least for an American-based scout like myself that has so many access points to evaluate these guys at all the various high school events. Obviously, they play in college. I mean, there's so many games, and the video is really great. And so, again, case by case, sometimes it's harder than is the next.
Yeah. Now, another element that can be difficult is a good player surrounded by great people makes a good player look a lot better. And then all of a sudden they look really good, but you say, all right, now if they get drafted by the Washington Wizards, who are just not in a great spot right now, can that translate? And so, a prime example this year is, Duke, they're talking about, hey, there could be 4 or 5 guys in the first round from Duke. And you say, well, I mean, they played with Cooper Flag, so organically that takes a lot of pressure off of anyone else because he's the focal point. All right, if they do get drafted on a team that maybe doesn't have star power, how does that translate? So when you're looking at it, it's hard to isolate that individual because you say, well, they're alongside this guy. They had the third best defender on every team guarding them. And hey, in the NBA, the third best defender is just a level above where they were at. How do you kind of, delineate or differentiate good players on great teams versus great players on great teams when they can kind of, benefit from the other teammates?
Sure, yeah, no, and I think that's a fair question, and it's challenging, and again, I think everything with the evaluation process really needs to be looked at case by case, and I know I'm being repetitive by saying that, but it's the truth, and I try to compartmentalize as much as I can, and again, really just kind of look at it as I'm needing to get to 100% confidence level on the evaluation and have it be a comprehensive evaluation regardless of what the circumstances are, right? And so really just kind of taking objective looks at all these different things and continuing to challenge myself to question my evaluation and be willing to bend based on new information. And so like, a guy that is playing a more complementary role on a great team, yeah, that's definitely a big part of just, kind of, developing a skill set and talent as an evaluator to read between the lines. And it's not a seamless process by any means. I mean, it's really I've said this before. I wrote about this of like the NBA draft and scouting as a whole. It's much less linear and more about kind of putting together a puzzle.
Yeah.
And I think compartmentalizing each player in each evaluation, really not putting ideas in a box, if you will. That's my approach, and just being being objective as possible in a pretty subjective space,
Yeah.
And it's just, I mean, that we all have opinions, whether we're experienced and have credibility, or there's, I mean, so many guys on Twitter now that are doing this as a hobby, which I love. I mean, that's really how I started doing this when I
Yeah.
got out of being a sports agent. And but anyway, you split it. There's a lot of opinions and a lot of different opinions on players and sort of how to process and value different pieces of information on players.
Love that. Now, within the draft, you're sitting here and these GMs are looking at it. And I guess a question, I don't know how much, back and forth you have with GMs, but are certain teams sitting there saying, we need this position, and regardless of if it's the seventh best player or the 27th best player, if it's the second best player at that position and we can get them, we want to take them? Or are a lot of teams saying, hey, we're just going for the best talent, that we can, and we'll fit them into our rotation? Or is it more based off of position where, like you mentioned earlier today, it's not positionless, but there's a lot of, fluidity between positions where it's not, 25 years ago where a point guard is a point guard and a shooting guard is a shooting guard. It's kind of like, well, yeah, you're the point guard role, but really you could be playing anywhere between 1 and 3, on any given night.
No, sure. I mean, the way I see it is, d different strokes for different folks, kind of thing, right? And so, I mean, depending on the person, the GM in the driver's seat, everybody usually has slightly different philosophies. Even though, I mean, it is somewhat of a copycat league. I mean, the Warriors, win a few titles. Everybody wants to play like the Warriors. The
Yep.
Celtics do it. They're now, trying to play like the Celtics. I mean, that does exist. But still, I mean, each general manager, each leader has their own style. And so, one thing that is consistent is GMs will always say to the media that they'll take the best player available. I think it's a deflecting answer, to be honest with you, because that can mean so many different things internally, right? Of course, they're trying to take the best player for their team, but
Yep.
I don't think that it's a situation to where there's a consensus on players, 1 through 60, that the next player is gonna be drafted by default. I would say in most cases, GMs and teams do value taking guys, good market value picks. I mean, I think that's sort of common sense in any kind of industry, right? But at the end of the day, if a general manager feels like a player has a good chance of succeeding in their program, they'll take him because it's the best thing for their team. And I think that's the simplest way of looking at it.
I love it. So to dive into this year's draft, number one is pretty unanimous that people feel good about that. 2 and 3, the gentleman out of Rutgers, people feel pretty unanimous about that. And then really after 3, it seems like that's where there becomes a lot more opinion based. Who would maybe either be a better fit, or hey, I kind of value this talent piece. So talk a bit about that in this year's draft with, that kind of 4 through the end being a little bit more of an open bag, depending on who goes where and what draft pick, happens next.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is a very interesting draft, and honestly, I say that every year. I love this stuff, but I mean, this is a good draft, at least at the top. I mean, having a clear-cut number one like Cooper, generates so much buzz by itself, and then after that, I think we've got several guys with star potential, and with how the lottery order, kind of shook out. I think there's some uncertainty of what's going to go down. I mean, there's all the rumblings of potential major trades, with veterans that could shake things up. And then Philly is rumored to be shopping that pick at number 3. And so, you asked before if I'm in communication with many NBA personnel, and I am, especially this last month leading up to the draft. I kind of shift being a scout to a little bit more of an intel gatherer, and and,
Yeah.
and put together the pieces. And if I were working for a team, or running a scouting department that wasn't public facing, I probably wouldn't even do mock drafts until we got closer to the pre-draft, right? And we obviously do it in the media early, but it's really sloppy. I mean, there's no way to split it. I mean, doing a mock draft in the fall, I mean, that's really just our starting point. And so the expectation of, when I'm putting these early rankings is, okay, I'm publishing, sort of my process where I'm at with everybody, while, honestly taking a look at some of the other outlets that I respect, of where they're at and really kind of gather and sort of pinpoint where I'm at in my evaluation process of each guy. But leading up to the draft, it's much more about projecting where I think the guys are going to pick, not as much of like my evaluation of them.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense. Now, well, I'm gonna ask you about a couple of specific players just because being here in Nebraska, we got a couple folks. We got Ryan Kalkbrenner that is we'll see where he ends up. He's a big, which to your point earlier, bigs are not as highly sought after, but has had a good run, at Creighton and multiple defensive player of the years. A lot of people are thinking kind of late first round. Where are you looking at with him, and what's kind of your evaluation there for him and translation to the next level?
I mentioned that, I always start off the evaluation with a blank canvas and, it feels like I've had like 10 years the paint calling predators. I know him like the back of my hand and spent many times at Creighton. I love scouting games at Creighton, great arena, and we got the
Well,
Marriott
hey,
right
when
across
you
the
come
street.
on
It's
through next time, we'll get
No,
some.
yeah, it's one of I love going to Omaha. That's one of my spots. So I've watched him a lot. And he does fall into, big bodied five that's a little slower. However, he shoots the ball well from outside and he's very coordinated.
Yeah,
And so I think he is somewhat of an exception of a big bodied five that does translate well. I do think he's got a chance of being a late first, early second round pick. Upside wise, I'm kind of looking at the role that Brooke Lopez is sort of evolved into. And so on the high side, I mean that's what you would hope for with Ryan. Obviously, a lot would need to go right for him to get to the Brooks level. Brooks had so much success,
right.
but I mean I think sort of penciling in or envisioning a role, a really big bodied five. They'll probably have to be in a lot of drop defensive coverage, but provides some rim protection and shoots the ball well enough from outside that the defense has to guard him. And
Yeah,
I think that's one thing I think people lose sight of is, especially for a big guy, he doesn't need to be a knockdown shooter to serve value in the NBA. You just have to guard him, and I think he shoots it well enough right now to provide that.
yeah. Now, when you compare that to like last year, Zach Edey was kind of the big name for the big guy that you're like, all right, that's probably going to be the first big drafted. And, I don't know this, but I would guess that probably goes into some of the, decisions Cochran made to come back, right? Well, gosh, if he's kind of the unanimous number one big, and I don't think he'll probably go until late first round, that means that I'm probably not going to go until at least the second round. So earlier you had mentioned, NIL is impacting players going back to school. So talk a little bit about that from the player standpoint when they're kind of looking at these draft boards. Obviously, they're competitors, so they probably think I could be better than that guy, but you don't ultimately control the decision. So talk about, kind of looking at your position and then also the impact of, yeah, but if I go back to school, I can make 700,000, and if I go undrafted, I'm probably
Right.
making 40,000 in the G League, and that's not going to work out as well.
Yeah, no, sure. I think I mean I keep bringing up how many moving parts there are,
Yep.
and with this part of the process that's all new. I mean, with NIL just sort of emerging here in the last few years, and this year the numbers just becoming absolutely outrageous. Everything is very extreme and honestly like surreal. I can't even. I have some of these conversations with agents and parents and stuff like that. I'm just like, this is unbelievable.
It
If you
really
told me
is.
this, 15 years ago when I was an agent, I wouldn't have believed you. And but here we are, and I think to sort of, break it down a little bit is, one important part of this is in the first round, players are getting 2 years guaranteed with 2 years team option, and in most cases the options get picked up, and so like there's pretty good security there, and
Yeah.
the money's good. The problem is for a second round pick, they're fully negotiable contracts, which means you're entitled to nothing other than a non-guaranteed minimum contract. Granted, most guys that are taken with decent picks in the second round are getting good deals, but it's not guaranteed.
Yep.
And it opens up risk. And so I mean, with some of these guys, like NBA level talents, second round picks, even undrafted type of guys, some of these kids are making 2-3 million a year with through NIL right now. And so like a two-way contract, which a lot of second round picks are getting two-way contracts. It's essentially half of the rookie minimum. So if I remember correctly, it's like roughly for next year it'll be like $635,000, which is a lot of money to your average person, right? Be a lot of money for me. I'd be very happy to take that salary. However, if you're comparing it to $2, $3 million a year in college, where you're going to be the man, big man on campus at a big school, and you're also continuing to build your brand and marketability. That's why these guys are making logical decisions because, in a lot of cases, these guys are being represented by agents before they even test the NBA draft waters. And so you've got some business people involved, and it's just logical. I mean, you're eliminating a lot of risk, while continuing to build your brand. And so I think it's going to be like that more and more, unless the NBA were to adjust things as far as maybe sweetening the pot a little bit for second round picks. I have not heard that been discussed, but as things stand right now, if a guy's not a lock to be, a first round pick, they're probably going back to school.
Yeah. Now, in the existence of a fellow Nebraskan, obviously Ryan is not a Nebraskan, but he played at Creighton. Hunter Salas, who's from Nebraska, spent some time at Gonzaga, transferred to Wake Forest, had a great year at Wake Forest, and depending on where you look at, there's some people that have him, kind of early mid second round. There's some people that have him undrafted. Talk a little bit about him if you're familiar with his game and where you'd place him.
Yeah, no, I actually know Hunter well personally. So I was a part of Damian Lillard's Form Zero, and we had Hunter out there as one of the camp counselors, and so I got to know him really well a few years ago, and I've kept up with him. And you're absolutely right. He struggled at Gonzaga after being a high profile recruit,
Yeah.
and just really took off at Wake Forest last year, and continued to do well this year too. And really great kid, just very dynamic scoring guard. They played him at point guard a lot this year. I think he's more of a 2-1, the dynamic score, but not your traditional floor general type. But yeah, I think he's got a good chance of getting drafted, and I'm really hoping he's able to kind of carve out a role for himself and stick.
Absolutely. Now, when you see a guy, like that, whether it's your, analysis or it's the GM's, and maybe they had a couple not so great years, but then they made a transfer or a new coach came in and it changes things. I know you said, "Hey, I started with a blank canvas. I'm kind of filling the canvas." Uh, how much credit do you give? All right, maybe I should erase this, or I should, cover this part of the canvas up and repaint it because wow, after that transfer, they just look a lot better. They've evolved, they've developed, or is that something where there's still a blemish because, well, we see the other side of what potential could be, and that is, you have the ability to kind of fade and not be a standout player.
Yeah, I mean, I think the best way of answering that is, evaluating a player is an ongoing process. I mean, for me, I'm NBA draft, so draft night, draft day, that's when it's final for me. But I mean, if you're looking at it from a team's perspective, they've got pro personnel scouts as well, and so like they keep evaluating these players even as they go into the pros, and that's kind of how I look at it. Before their draft. So I mean, like with Hunter, for example, yeah, I mean, expectations were high for him out of high school, and we weren't very excited about him at Gonzaga, right? And a lot of people were writing him off. But I think him transferring really kind of recreating himself. It shows a lot of resilience and toughness, which being a pro, especially being sort of a fringe pro, where you're not like this hyped up Cooper Flag type, where the pathway is very clear. Those are things I value, and that's one, those are the types of things that we look for when we're doing background intel work on guys of like who are they, like what adversity have they faced, and what's their support system like. I mean, all these different things, kind of the process you would probably go through before deciding if you're gonna get married or not, right? It's like, is this somebody I want to partner with, right? And that's kind of how I look at it from a team standpoint of like, is this somebody we want to invest millions of dollars in? You want to know what they're all about, and so I think facing some adversity and kind of getting over the hurdle. I mean, those are just I mean, pretty common sense, but just very appealing traits to be able to show.
Absolutely. I love it. Now, something that's been kind of interesting as we're in the playoffs, deep in the playoffs right now, is looking at teams today that are we're just going to use, the Thunder and the Rockets. Rockets are obviously bounced out, but really building the foundation off draft picks, right? They're saying, hey, we traded a lot of our stars away. It took us a couple years of being irrelevant, but now we've drafted well and we've built up good foundations and good teams. Whereas I think 3, 4, 5 years ago, all the teams that were making it were the big twos or the big threes, right? It was less about who you were drafting and more about who you sold the draft picks or traded the draft picks for. So as you see some of these teams have success, do you start thinking, hey, we're coming into draft night? You mentioned the Sixers already that, all right, some of these teams might find themselves at a spot where we're pretty far away from being championship ready. Hey, do we just go ahead and, trade a big name away and start the rebuilding process? How early are GMs talking about this, and how much of that is pretty set going into draft night that, hey, we're actively gonna, try and make this happen, versus, hey, it's on the radar, but I'm not overly focused there.
Well, I mean, I think the first thought that comes to mind is Sam Presti, right? I mean, Sam is really kind of set the standard for how to do this process properly. And I mean, I remember when he traded Paul George and West, I mean, everybody was going nuts. Like this is a bold move. He pulled it off. I mean, he got all the draft capital for. I mean, did it over the course of several years where they're just stockpiling draft assets
Yeah.
and gradually accumulating young talent and. He's done a great job with his staff of evaluating players, and they haven't hit perfectly on every single pick, but they've hit on enough,
Yeah,
and
right,
their
right.
and their team is big time as a result, right? And so I think part of that with a rebuild, a lot of it depends on the situation of how much security does that general manager have, in a lot of cases, if a general manager does not have that security. I personally wouldn't suggest rebuilding because he probably won't survive it. And
Right.
um, my uncle Rob went through it in Toronto, and they had a group decision to trade Vince Carter just because Vince didn't want to be there anymore, and they kind of decided, hey, let's clear up some cap room, let's kind of redo this. And it's sort of similar to what Nico Harrison's going through with the Luka trade is it was not well received. And like who was left out to dry? The general manager, right?
Yeah.
And so I think Sam's situation was unique because he just had so much credibility and juice within in his team. He was able to do it. But I mean, I think he's shown, and Houston doing this the same way as far as accumulating young talent. It definitely is doable. It's a hard thing to execute because going through a rebuild, it's just grueling. I feel like a lot of times owners and the front office as a whole will be on board with the process. However, the negativity wears on everybody, and so I think it's one of those things in most cases easier said than done.
Yeah. Well, and I'm gonna ask this just because I'm curious, but you look at some of these franchise that unfortunately have for a very long time continued to not be great, and I mean the Kings are one of those where it just they were great in the early 2000s, but really since then you've kind of brought in one star and it just hasn't quite worked out. And you bring in a new star and maybe you win a few more games, but it's still not, competitive. In that instance, do you feel like it's more of a culture type of a dynamic, or do you feel like it's, draft picks that just don't mesh well, or, maybe they're not building players up, they're drafting good players, but they're not developing them past where they're at? Once again, I'm sure multiple things that are a part of it, but what's kind of your analysis with some of the different organizations that, for whatever reason, have continuously, kind of been on the lower end of playoffs or maybe not making playoffs consistently?
I mean, I think we've probably seen a little bit of it all, and I do think one sort of key theme with the NBA, at least the teams that find high levels of success, is it's a very star-driven league, and it's hard to get your hands on stars. And even when you get a star, things need to go well. I mean, as far as like you need them to stay healthy. I mean, I think back about like Kevin Pritchard's teams in Portland. I mean, they get Greg Oden, they had Aldridge and Brandon Roy. And,
Brandon
I
Roy.
mean, you would have thought that team would have been dominant for years, and they just had some bad luck. I mean, obviously with Oden getting injured, Brandon Roy's shelf life was so short. And that's just one example. But I mean, there's a lot of luck into it as far as just, finding one, just getting, winning on lottery night.
Yeah.
I mean, how many teams have tanked and didn't get a top pick, and it's we had a few teams this year. Utah and Washington. I mean, that's tough. I mean, they slipped back to 5 and 6. Both of them wanted Cooper Flag. There's no doubt about it, right?
Right.
And so, I mean, some of it is just getting lucky and and your guys staying, identifying the right guys, getting the right guys, and hopefully they stay healthy. And it's tough. I mean, it's a tough business, but I do think, especially with smaller market teams, you're probably not going to build your teams through trades and free agencies in most cases. It's going to be through the draft. I mean, like for example, I look at Minnesota. Tim Connolly's done a great job of getting some pieces together. But what really is making it work there is Anthony Edwards.
That's right.
And Anthony Edwards is not the kind of guy that you would have been able to get to Minnesota via free agency. That had to be a draft night situation. And so that organization is benefiting from winning the lottery, and I think that these teams are very dependent again of having some luck in that regard.
I love it. So this draft, what or who are one or two players that you think are maybe not even sleepers, but you just think, hey, they're not the top three guys, but I think they've got great opportunity to have star type potential. Who's maybe one or two guys that you feel like people are placing high that maybe you aren't as high on for them and star potential in the NBA?
Yeah, I mean, so this guy has gotten a lot of credibility and juice as of late, but I've been high on him since the fall. Is Jeremiah Fears at Oklahoma?
Yeah.
I just absolutely love the kid. I've evaluated, I've actually known him and his family since he was in high school, and he's come around like crazy. I mean, he just had such an incredible year. I was expecting him to be an NBA player. I didn't think he'd be this far along this fast, and. I mean, he's looking like he's got a chance of being a top five-ish type pick. Just a tough on-ball point guard pick and roll scorer. Just yeah, I think he's got a lot of upside. And what's crazy is that he reclassified. He's supposed to be a senior in high school this year. He's only 18 years old, and so I just think the sky is the limit for him. Another name that comes to mind. This guy is projected a little bit lower is Jon Berenger, a French player that played in Slovenia this year. Big guy, has only been playing basketball for a few years, but I mean, he's already doing some really good things at the pro level. His physical tools are nuts. He's big, he's strong, he's mobile. He plays really, really hard, which I think is a lot, oftentimes like overlooked
Yeah.
skill. I mean, playing hard is a lot of times half the battle, and this
Yeah.
kid's got it at a very young age. And I heard an interesting story about him. He's really good defensively, as far as like being this big switchable defender as a five and an incredible rebounder. And I heard that he has one thing that's contributed to being having such a high motor is that he was a goalie in soccer, and he kind of takes the same approach as a goalie, where you have to always have your head on a swivel and move your feet and just be constantly active. He's applied that to basketball, which I think is pretty cool. And especially after identifying these things as him as a prospect, and then learning that after the fact, it was kind of like, huh, well, that's noteworthy, And so
Yeah.
those are two names that come to mind. I could probably keep going. There's a number of guys I like in this draft, but I do think I'm probably a little higher on both those kids than others.
I love that. Now, talking about trades, you mentioned earlier, what are maybe one or two trades out there that you've either heard rumors of or you're like, hey, I think these would be teams to be, watching for potentially making trades of significant value in the draft.
Well, the elephant in the room is Milwaukee. My dad's been with the Milwaukee Bucks front office for 28 years, so I'm not going to go there.
Yeah.
I don't know what's going to happen, but I will say this: I'll root for Giannis, whether he's on the Bucks or anywhere else. The one team that I'm keeping an eye on, that everybody is, and it's been pretty public, is Philly at 3, and they're in an interesting spot. They've got a couple aging stars that have had injury problems with Joel Embiid and Paul George. And I think at 3, there's not a clear-cut player of like, hey, this is the guy. I mean, my guess would be Ace Bailey just based off upside. But I could see them moving that pick, probably trying to get some financial relief, but likely Paul George's contract would be my best guess.
Yeah.
So that And that's a very critical pick in the draft, because I
Right.
mean, there's even though I've got my own ranking, and I think every team probably would on some level or another. One team shaking it up changes the domino effect potentially dramatically, right? And so
Yep.
not knowing who's going to go at three um, makes my job pretty interesting doing these mock drafts.
Absolutely. Now, in an instance like that, just using them, they've had two good draft picks of, Tyrese Maxey and Jared McCain, young pieces that they can build on. But once again, that also then probably limits a little bit of who they're trying to get or who would be potential fits for them at a future pick.
No, there's no doubt, and because like two guys that I'm very high on, I just mentioned Jeremiah Fears, but also VJ Edgecombe, who's more of a two guard, but he's a guard. And do you use a high lottery pick on a player that is going to create a logjam with your two other stars and young developing stars still? I mean, I don't think either of those guys. I mean, Tyrese has done such great things, but he's still a young guy too. I mean,
Yeah.
I think both guys. I mean, especially Jared, it's probably just tip of the iceberg. And so, do you want to do anything that's going to stunt their growth or invest in a player where there's not a clear pathway for him to find success within your team? And so, those are factors too that I mean, I think each team would probably juggle them, slightly differently. But I mean, you going back to your question before, as far as like, do you just take the best player available? And I don't know. I mean, I think that's a tough question in some cases, and I think Philly at three could potentially that I would assume that question's being raised.
Yeah. Well, and I think the easy thing to say is, hey, with the third pick, we took the best player available. The tough thing is the 5 years down the road, right? Where you go, well, we thought we were taking the best player available, but really, we had that miss and the scrutiny that comes with it, right?
Right. Oh, there's no doubt. Yeah, I mean, and being a general manager in the NBA, I mean, it's tough. I mean, there's not a whole lot of room for error. The media, the fan base will just they'll come after your head, right? And in most cases, it'll work at some point or another. And but same argument though of like, okay, I do believe that players do need good situations to succeed in most cases. Like I don't think every guy, like, I mean, we can even look at probably some Hall of Famers if they hadn't got with the right coach in the right situation to develop properly. And I'm not even talking about just like on court talent development,
Yep.
psychological development, like the confidence. I mean, if you don't have confidence, like you're not hitting shots, right? And
Yep.
so I do think people overlook some of these cases that guys could have done better if they gone somewhere else or vice versa. And I'm a big believer in that. And I mean, from a scout's perspective, but also as a former agent, I'm a big believer in it does need to make sense for both parties for it to work. And I really look at it as a partnership. I mean, you're drafting a guy, it's got to be mutually beneficial for it to make sense.
Yeah. Well, and once again, referencing Omaha, we think of last year Baylor Shireman, getting drafted by the Celtics, and you go, probably couldn't have had a better fit.
Right.
I mean, you go to the team that just won the championship, they've got a lot of talented players that you can come in, and if you can shoot the ball well, you're going to look great. And outside of that, you really don't have to do a whole lot because they've got playmakers, they've got the lockdown defender. You just need to come in and be able to shoot the ball. And you sit there and you go, yeah, if all of a sudden instead you got drafted to Utah, I mean, the career trajectory for you just looks a lot different.
Sure. Yeah, no, absolutely. And I mean, I think that goes with high profile guys and then also fringe guys like Baylor, And so, I mean, I think, finding that right spot and, making most of the opportunities, I mean, it's the name of the game. And it's, in a lot of cases, it's not a linear process for a lot of these guys. And so I think, I think certain players sometimes do fall between the cracks and others, maximize their opportunity if a unique one presents itself.
Love it. Well, any one or two last predictions, comments for the draft coming up? And then the last question I have is, where do you watch the draft? Are we in Milwaukee with that? Are we doing it from the comfort of our own home? Do we have friends that we go do this with? Tell us a little bit about your draft night setup.
Yeah, I mean, I've done some media at the draft before. Typically, I'll do some kind of live stream. We're discussing some options right now. I'll probably be right here in my office,
Yeah.
doing some, doing a bunch of media. But yeah, definitely not a time to be with family or friends. And I'm definitely not welcome in Milwaukee's war room since I'm speaking to the whole league essentially. But yeah, no, draft night. Well, now it's 2 nights,
Yeah.
which is so much better. But yeah, no, draft night is probably my favorite day of the year.
I agree with you. It is mine as well. So I'll be hitting you up that day, much before the draft. I know during the draft will be off limits, but Matt, I just want to say thank you again for hopping on, sharing your knowledge, your expertise, and excited to watch the NBA draft, to hear your analysis, and do it again next year.
No, it sounds great. No, thanks again for having me.